In today's video, I'm going to go through a step-by-step guide to build this simple vertical card holder. I'll be using the most basic and straightforward method so that everyone should be able to follow. I'm going to show and explain each step, so if you're a beginner to leathercraft, this build will be perfect for you. I've made the pattern for this project available for everyone. Simply download it from the link in the video description. This card holder is quite simple to construct, with only a single stitching line that runs around the edge. It is suitable to hold 2 cards in the front pocket and another 2 cards or cash in the middle pocket. As you use the card holder, the leather will stretch and mold to the contents, and you'll be able to fit more cards. Now let's start on this project. These are all of the tools and materials I will be using for this project. I have the required tools here, the optional tools here, and the materials over here. I have listed all of them in the video description. Do not worry if you don't have all of these tools, as some of the steps, such as edge creasing, will be optional. I will also suggest alternative tools where possible. I'm going to be explaining more about each tool when we come to them, so for now, let's get started. So the first step is to download and print your paper pattern from the link in the video description. Make sure when you print it that you select actual size or 100% scaling. Otherwise the scale might be off. You can use the scale box here and a ruler to check that you have the scale right. You should get exactly 30 millimeters. The broken line on the outside is a 3 millimeter trim allowance line. This allows you to trim the outsides after gluing to give you very clean edges. For this video, I will be using the most basic method, so the trim line is not required. The inside line here is the stitching line. This line is set 3 millimeters inside of the edge, which is the center line. The most important line is the middle line, as this is the final outline of the project. This is the line that I will be using for this video. Now I'm going to cut each part of the pattern roughly with a craft knife, and I will just offset the final outline around 3 to 5 millimeters. So when starting a new project, you should always start with a new blade. So now I'll cut each piece around 3 to 5 millimeters, offset from the middle line. Alright, now we've got all our pieces cut out, let's have a look at our leather. I'm going to be using this natural vegetable tan leather. You should be using vegetable tan leather for this project, not chrome tan, as a card holder needs to have a firm temper to keep its shape. This piece here is 1 millimeter thick. Now I would recommend thicknesses from 1 millimeter to 1.2 millimeters for this project, but you could probably get away with using up to 1.5 millimeters. But just keep in mind, as the leather gets thicker, the card holder is going to get a lot more bulky. Okay, now we have our paper pattern here. Just want to select where on this leather I'm going to be using for this project. So I'll roughly cut this out. Okay, so now we've got these pieces cut into smaller, more manageable sizes. Now the next step is to secure the pattern paper to the leather to make it really easy to cut out. Now I find the best way to do this is with some Scotch tape. And this basically ensures that your pattern paper is not going to move. Now again, you need to be working with a really sharp knife. That curved section is probably the hardest part of this. So once that's done, we can work on the straight sections. Now just make sure that you're using the middle line, which is the shape outline, and not the trim line. Now you don't always have to cut it in one pass, especially if you've got thicker leather. Multiple passes is fine as long as you don't move your ruler while you're cutting. Right, now that's our first piece cut out. It's a little bit rough around these, but that's not a problem. When we come to sanding, we'll clean everything up. So the other thing to note is I'm working off a self-healing cutting mat, and these are ideal to work off. Make sure that you don't damage your blade while you're cutting. Now that we have our pattern all cut out, we need to complete this edge on this piece here. We need to do it now because we're not going to be able to do it later. So we'll start by just sanding down that edge. But if you do a good cut, there shouldn't be too much sanding to do. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put a crease line on this edge. So I'll set up our marble top, and this gives us a really hard edge to be able to put in a crease line properly. So creasing is an optional step and it's not required for the project, but it does help to add like a little decorative line here. It makes the project overall look a little bit better. We'll also use this after we've done our stitching. So the edge creaser that I have here is a FN2 tip. This is probably one of the better ones. It gives a nice soft decorative line. Okay, so we're ready to start. When we do the edge creasing, we need just to make sure that we give a nice slow but firm line. And so if we need to, we can actually go over this line again if the crease wasn't deep enough. Okay, so this creasing is done now. We just need to finish off this edge here. Normally I would use a beveller, but I think this edge is a little bit too fine to use it. I'll give it a go. Yeah, so this one is a number 1. There is a smaller version, number 0. But finally I'm not able to get too much of that. But that looks fine for now. So next step, we're going to burnish this edge. And I'm going to burnish it using this Tokenole burnishing gum. The alternative is to use water. So the way we do it is just apply a small amount to the edge. Now when it comes to burnishing this, we could use either a wood slicker, or we could go with some canvas. Generally I use sort of both interchangeably, but for this job I think the slicker will do a better job. So we just run this up and down. Okay, so that's done now. That's a finished edge. So now we'll continue on with the assembly. So another option is a maker's stamp or some kind of personalized stamp. I think it's a good idea to do any stamping while the pieces are still separate. So now we're ready for assembly. I'm going to be putting these two pieces together first, and then we'll put this front pocket on later. So I'll put this one aside for now. We're going to need to mark a gluing line. So I'm going to do that with these dividers here, and I've set them to 3 millimeters. So it's hard to see, but this line here, it just gives us a guide so we know exactly where to place our glue. For glue, I'm going to be using contact cement, and this is a glue pot that I made in a previous video. So we carefully just apply our glue using that 3 millimeter line as our guide. So that's our first piece. And the benefit of using a glue pot, so you get to use a brush. You can actually hold a lot more glue than a applicator. So those two pieces are ready now. So we'll let them dry out a little bit until they're tacky, and then we'll put them together. Okay, we gave the contact glue a little bit of time to dry, and now it's tacky. So this is a perfect time to glue these two pieces together. So when we do this, we need to be very careful. Probably the most important area is the circles. So we'll get them matched up, and we will glue this very carefully. So start on this corner here. And we'll move across. So when you're happy with that, we're going to just hammer it down, make sure we get the two sides completely pressed together. Okay, so now these two pieces are well and truly stuck together. They're not going to come apart anymore. So the next step is we're going to be attaching the front pocket. To do that, we just need to make sure we get it in the exact right position. Now I'm going to take a scratch awl and I'm just going to mark where the pocket meets the body. So now we've got those two marks there. Okay, now I'm going to mark out where we're going to be roughing up this piece, because right now if we apply glue onto this section, it's not going to take. So just mark out again with the 3mm line with the dividers. And now we're going to need to rough this up. So there's a few tools that you could use here. So the specialized tool is this rougher. But you can actually use your basic craft knife or leather knife to do this. So basically we're just going to just rough up this edge. And this will make sure that the glue gets a really good bond. Now, same thing for this piece. Let's mark our 3mm gluing line. And because this piece is on the flesh side, that is the reason why we don't need to rough it up before we apply the glue. Okay, so similar to before, we've got that line here. Let's apply some glue. So again, we'll leave this contact cement to dry up a little bit and then we'll glue them together. So we gave the contact cement a little bit of time to dry and now it's tacky and ready to stick together. So when we stick this front pocket on, just need to make sure that we stick it in the correct position here. So I'll start off with this left side here. And I'll align it to that mark we did previously. Now onto the right. Okay. And again with the hammer. Just with the hammer, make sure that the hammer you use is a round face hammer. It needs to be really smooth, otherwise it's going to damage your leather project. Okay, so now this is ready and assembled. The next step is we're going to sand and get these edges really flat and straight. So I have my sandpaper here, and then we're just going to go over this. And depending on how good you did your gluing, you might need to sand actually quite a bit. So the sandpaper I'm using here is a 240 grit. which is good for first rough sanding, and then later on I think I'll move down to a 400 grit, something a little bit finer. Okay, that's it for sandpaper now. Now we're ready to put in our stitching line. So now we're ready to put in our stitching line. Now we're going to do it according to the pattern, which is just a single line all around the edge. Now there's a few ways we can put in the stitching holes. One way would be just to trace the holes from the pattern. But the better way is to put in a stitching line. Now there's two tools that can do that. One of them is the stitching groover, which will make a groove and a line. However, today I'm going to be using just simple dividers. So these dividers have been set to 3mm, same as the pattern. So now we'll put in our stitching line. Okay, so now we've got our stitching line in place. We're ready to punch our holes. So to punch holes, I'm using my punching board, which has a piece of scrap leather on. To punch the holes, I'll be using a 4mm diamond chisel, same as the pattern. So the best way to approach your chiseling is to plan all of your holes before you start punching any of them. So the way to do that is just to position where your chisel is going to go. So when you come to the corner, you need to be using a 2-prong and just follow on from the previous hole. You want to be a little bit careful around the top of this pocket. What you don't want is to position the prong right on the top of the pocket so you split that. Your prong should really fall one on the top side and one on the bottom side. And if you follow the pattern, everything should be okay. Because now all of our holes have been marked out, it's now really easy for us to punch them. We don't have to worry about having some hole spacing incorrect, too big or too small, or perhaps in the wrong area. We need to make sure that when we punch our holes, the chisel must be exactly vertical. If the chisel is angled either way, the hole on the back side is going to come in the wrong position and the stitching is going to look bad. So it's really important in terms of stitching that the holes are as good as possible. Now for punching, I'm going to be using this poly mallet, and it's important that the mallet that you use is not steel, otherwise it's going to damage the tip of all of your punches. So we can see here that the chisel has fully penetrated the back of the piece, and that's really important because we need the backside to have good shaped holes. And the way to do that is to have some scrap leather underneath your workpiece. It makes it a lot easier for your chisel to punch through. So if we have a look on the back side, we can see the slanted shape of all of our holes, which is good. We can also see that they are fairly straight. There doesn't seem to be any big deviation, which is really important. So with this, we should be able to get nice looking stitching on both sides. We are now ready to begin stitching our project. So the first thing we do is we need to measure the length of the stitching line. So that's quite simple here. We just run this along the ruler and we get a length of 25 centimeters. So in order to get our length of thread, we'll just multiply that by 4. So I'm going to measure out 1 meter of thread. And the thread that I'm going to be using today is this Amy Roke 0.55 millimeter, and it's in the blue coral color. That should brighten up this project a little bit. So I'll measure out for 1 meter. So now let's thread our needles, and the way to do this is pass the thread through the needle hole, and then we wrap it twice, and then we need to pierce the thread here. Something like that. So that thread gets pierced there. Then when we pull that through, we'll get a little pierced section there. We pull that up to the back of the needle. And now that's in a lock position, like that. That's not coming out. So I'll do the same with the second needle. So we pull the thread through, wrap the thread twice around the needle, and then we use the needle to puncture the thread. And then we'll pull it tight. And again, that's going to lock that thread into place. I have set up the card holder in a stitching pony. The stitching pony makes stitching a lot easier as it frees up one of your hands. However, saddle stitching can be done without a stitching pony, but it just makes the job a lot more difficult and slower. When we come to stitch this piece, I want to do a double stitch on this first hole here. So I'm going to start with the second hole and pass the needle through. I want to have both lengths exactly the same. And then we'll go through the first hole. Just want to make sure that the thread is sitting in the correct part of the hole, which is the bottom part here and the top part of this hole here. Okay, and then we can begin saddle stitching as normal. So we put our first needle in through the hole. We pull back on both sides of the thread, and we pass the second needle through the back of the hole. We make sure that we didn't puncture that or pierce that thread. And we wrap it around that. And then we pull it through. This first one's really important. Ideally, we want to have the threads sitting on top of each other. So it's going to look a lot cleaner, like that. When we pull, we need to make sure that we pull it to the correct part of the hole. So I'll be pulling this side up and on the reverse side I will also be pulling it up direction. Okay, let's go with our second hole. So right needle in first, we're pulling back on both threads. Second needle goes through the back of the hole. We come up and wrap around this needle like that, and then we pull through. And when we're pulling, we want to be pulling in a up and forward direction, like that. Sorry, up and forward like that. Same on the reverse side. This will make sure that the stitching will be sitting in the correct part of the hole. So basically we just repeat this process. We're coming to the end of the stitching here, so we've only got 2 holes left. So we'll do these 2 as normal. Okay, that was our last hole there. Now we're going to come back and do a double stitch on that last hole. So we're going to bring this is our front side here. We'll bring the thread back to the other side. So we'll make sure we don't puncture that thread. And bring it back nice and carefully. When we do that, let's try and get that top thread in line with the bottom. Something like that. We can do the same on the other side. Just repeat it and bring this thread over. And then one last time we'll bring this thread to the back side, and then we'll end both threads on the back side. And get those 2 in line again as best as we can. So the stitching ended up quite well. Let's flip this over to our back side, and we'll finish off these ends. So the way to do this is just to snip these ends off. You can probably use a knife as well, and we'll give it around 2 millimeters, the length of those ends. And next we'll take any kind of lighter, we'll just burn those ends, melt them down, and then just push them down into place. And that's going to make sure that thread doesn't come loose. Okay, now we're going to hammer these stitches down, and this is going to help them to sort of lie flatter and sort of sink into the leather a little bit. Same thing on the front side. Now that stitching is complete. Now we are ready to edge crease along the edge outside of the stitching. Again, this process is decorative only and is purely optional. Now that we're finished on the edge creasing, I'm going to bevel this edge, which means just taking off this corner piece along the edge. So that's going to leave the edge looking a little bit more round. It'll be a bit easier to burnish. So to do that, again with the edge beveler, you need to make sure that it's always sharp before you use it. So we'll start on this side. Now that the beveling is complete, we should have a much rounder edge over there. The other thing that we can round out is these corners here. They are quite sharp now and very easy to get damaged during use. So the way to do this is we're just going to clip these corners off. And we'll just take a very, very small amount off. Now that we've rounded off these corners, we're ready to begin burnishing the edge. So similar to before, I'm going to be using the Tokenole again. But of course, you could do this with water and achieve a similar result. So I'll just apply it lightly over the edge. And then I'm going to use this wooden slicker again. The alternative was the canvas cloth, which also can be used for this job. You can actually use a smaller diameter wood slicker, which is easier to get within these smaller edges. Now you should end up with a nice burnished edge. Should look a little bit shiny. Congratulations if you made it to the end of the build. I hope you were able to follow all the steps and end up with your own leather card holder. Leathercraft, like all skills, is something that you develop with practice, and you're only going to get better from here. So keep working at it, and keep making new projects. For each type of leathercraft skill that I've used today, I have a separate video teaching you more about it. For example, on leather stitching, leather chisels, and leather knives. I'll leave links to these in the video description. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.